This movie is on more array functions, namely the transpose function, which we talked about before, but we're going to revisit it and do some things within the transpose function with the array that's created in the transpose function. And then we're going to contrast the forecast and the trend function. So the transpose, trend, and forecast functions. We're going to begin by talking about the transpose function, which we talked about before, but we're going to revisit it. And the transpose function allows you to take a vertical-oriented grouping of cells and change it to a horizontal orientation, or vice versa. And that can be 1, 2, 3 rows, or 1, 2, 3 columns, 4 columns. In this case, we have 2 columns. I'm going to select the data, and when I do that, in the name box, I get some help. If this was larger, it might be difficult to tell how many columns and how many rows this data occupies, but I can see the name box telling me it's 6 rows and 2 columns. So that being the case, I'm going to want 2 rows and 6 columns. From here, I'm going to enter the transpose function. I'm going to select the array, close the function with a parentheses, press CTRL+SHIFT+ENTER, and I get my result. The thing is that I have 2 blank fields. And what the transpose function delivers by default is a 0. And that may not be what you want. So I've selected my area, and I'm going to input the transpose function. But now I have to build some conditions, because I want to transpose those values in the selected array based on whether there's a blank or not. So I'm going to transpose if is blank the array, comma, and if that's true, if it finds a blank cell, I want it to return a blank cell instead of a 0. And if it's not true, then I want it to return what's in the array. I'm going to close up the first parentheses, the second parentheses, and then press CTRL+SHIFT+ENTER, and I get my result where the blank cells now are generating a blank cell instead of a 0. So the purpose of this is really beyond the scope of just the transpose function. It's to show that you can do things with the array that's created within the array formula, and that you can generate an array where there otherwise would be a single result. So the if function is testing an array instead of a single cell and generating a result that's an array instead of a single cell. On to the forecast and trend function. Now, I don't claim to be a baseball fan. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the game. I just don't happen to follow it. But these statistics kind of marry up to what I'm trying to show with the forecast and trend function. So this is the 2005 series in which there were a total of 136 regular season games. It's a comparison of the payroll in terms of millions of dollars to the amount of games won in that season for each of the American League teams, except for one. I've pulled the New York Yankees out of this because they're an outlier. And what I want to do is use the forecast and trend function to determine how many games they should have won based on the slope created from this relationship between the amount of money spent and the games won. There is a bit of a relationship between the amount of money spent and the amount of games won because the slope is greater than 1. It's not that much greater than 1, but it's a little greater than 1. So for those additional dollars spent, you're going to win a few more additional games. But the graph that's depicting this relationship kind of suggests the whole strategy that was behind the people that were depicted in the movie Moneyball. Because the blue line shows that you can spend a whole lot more money and you're just not going to win that many more games. So the forecast function. The forecast function is a cell-by-cell calculation of taking an X and forecasting a Y for the known Y's, the independent variable, and the known X's, the dependent variable. I'm going to close that up, Control-Enter, and the forecast 92 for $120 million, and I'm going to make these absolute references so I can copy this formula down. And for the investment, the New York Yankees, according to this simplistic sort of analysis, should have won 112 games instead of 95. So the forecast function is great for forecasting a linear relationship between known x's and y's, but it's not very efficient because it calculates the slope and the intercept for each of these cells that the forecast function is in. One cell is not related to the other. The trend function is our array function. And what it does is it will calculate a lot more efficiently and give you the same result that the forecast function gives you, only it's going to do it in a lot more efficient way. Of course, you won't see that because we don't have but about a dozen data points here. So I've set this up. I press CTRL+SHIFT+ENTER for my resultant array. I get the same numbers that the forecast gave, but it's a whole lot more efficient. So if you have a lot of trend analysis to do, use the trend instead of the forecast function. So that's the transpose, trend, and forecast function. We looked at the transpose function where we could transpose a series of columns or rows from vertical to horizontal and vice versa. And when you run into the instance where you have blanks within your cells that you're transposing, the transpose function will by default give you zeros. Well, there's a way to get rid of those zeros. And we did that to depict that you can actually utilize the arrays that are created within the formula, and you can also provide the formula with an array rather than a single cell as a reference. We then looked at the forecast and trend function, where the forecast calculates on an individual cell basis, and the trend function calculates as a resultant array, and it only has to calculate the slope and the intercept one time, so it's a lot more efficient.